What if I told you that Jesus, yes, that Jesus, is mentioned in ancient texts outside the Bible? What if I told you that we can learn things about him from those texts that might surprise us? Now, many Christians take the Bible literally, verse by verse. They think everything we know about Jesus comes only from the four Gospels. On the other hand, many non-believers think he never really existed. They think he's just an invented character whose story was written long after the fact, kind of like an ancient superhero. But what if the real story is even more surprising? Let me ask you, did Jesus really exist? And if so, what do non-biblical sources tell us about him? To answer this question, let's look at some ancient records written by people who were not Christians. In some cases, they were even against Christianity. Why are their writings important? Well, because they show that Jesus wasn't just a figment of some people's imagination. He was a historical figure who really lived. So let's see what these sources say. First, we have a book called The Histories, written by the Roman historian Tacitus, around 116 AD. Now, Tacitus had a pretty bad attitude towards Christians. He thought they were a bunch of weirdos who deserved punishment. But here's what he said about Jesus. Under the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate, there was produced a great affliction. A man called Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, was crucified by the sentence of the governor. Yes, that's right. Even though Tacitus didn't like Christians, he wrote about a man named Christus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He also explained that the name Christian came from this man. You might be wondering why a Roman governor would crucify someone unless that someone had done something really bad, right? Well, not necessarily. Crucifixion was a common form of punishment in those days, often used on people who were seen as a threat to the Roman Empire. It wasn't always about what they had done, but rather what the rulers thought they might do in the future. Now, you might be thinking, who's Pontius Pilate? Well, he's the same guy who's mentioned in the Bible when he washed his hands after sentencing Jesus to death. John 18:29 says, Pilate went out to meet them and asked them, Barabbas. When he had called him, he made him come forth. Basically, Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea at the time of Jesus. He's a bit of a controversial figure since he's responsible for Jesus' death. However, outside the Bible, we have several references to him. For example, in a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan, the Jewish historian Josephus talks about how the Jews asked Pilate to remove a statue of a Roman emperor that was on the Temple Mount. When he refused, they revolted, but Pilate crushed the uprising. So yeah, there's no doubt that Pontius Pilate really existed and that he had the power to crucify people. But wait, there's more. The next piece of evidence comes from another Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. He wrote a book called Antiquities of the Jews around 93 AD, and he gave a detailed account of Jesus and his crucifixion. It goes like this. About this time, there lived in Jerusalem a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was such that the people all felt he was a benefactor, sent to them from God, and many became his disciples. He went up to Jerusalem, and some high priests and scribes took offense at him, and delivered him up to Pontius Pilate, the governor. And on the governor's recommendation, he was crucified on the cross. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon him. They believed that he was the Messiah, the one spoken of in the prophets, that he would rise again after 3 days and would save his people from the bonds of sin. For he himself had said this. For many generations his disciples did not cease to proclaim these teachings, and to announce to all the nations that Christ had risen from the dead and had ascended into heaven. Okay, I'll admit that last part sounds kind of weird, like some New Age guru stuff. But let's focus on the main part, the part where he talks about Jesus being crucified by Pontius Pilate. Now, some people say that that line was added later by Christian copy editors. It's like they found the original manuscript and were like, hey, we got to add some Jesus stuff in here. But most historians say the core of his text is genuine, even the negative parts. I mean, if someone has a bad attitude towards Jesus and his followers, it wouldn't make sense for them to lie and say that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, right? So it seems like both Tacitus and Josephus thought Jesus was a real person who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, but we have more proof. The Roman governor Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to the emperor Trajan in 112 AD. He was talking about how to deal with Christians in his province. And here's what he said. They were in the habit of meeting in a building on the outskirts of the city and singing hymns to Christ as to a god. So even though Pliny didn't like Christians either, he admitted that they were led by someone named Christ. And he said they really believed he was a god. Okay, so far we have 2 historians and a governor who all agree that Jesus was a real person. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he was considered divine by his followers. But what about the people who knew Jesus personally? How did they view him? Well, according to the Bible, Jesus had a brother named James. He didn't believe in Jesus at first, but then he saw the risen Jesus and became a believer. Later, James led the church in Jerusalem. So we have a couple of options here. We could ignore him because he's mentioned only in the Bible, or we could consider him as a valuable source because he was Jesus' brother. Alright, let's talk about James. He's mentioned in the Bible quite a bit, especially in a book called the Epistle of James. But he's also mentioned outside the Bible in the work of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. Remember him? It's a guy who wrote Antiquities of the Jews. Well, Josephus wrote another book called The Jewish War, and in it he talked about a revolt that happened in Jerusalem. Here's what he said. And when they had taken their stand in the temple, the high priest Ananus, son of Seth, a man of very small stature, but great arrogance, assembled a great multitude and gave orders to them to bring forth James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and certain others. Now, some people will say, aha, see, even Josephus added the part about Jesus. But notice that Josephus calls Jesus the Christ. That was a common way to refer to him back then. He also mentions James, the brother of Jesus. So if anyone could cast doubt on whether Jesus was divine, it would be his own brother. But instead, James testified that Jesus was real. So that's 5 sources that tell us Jesus was a real person. But we have one more, a bonus source. It comes from a Greek writer named Lucian of Samosata. He was a bit of a jerk, to be honest, because he made fun of Christians and their beliefs. He wrote a book called The Death of Peregrine, and in it he had a character say, "They believed that one who was crucified by order of the governor was a god." The very people who had seen him suffer torture and death openly declared that he was divine. Now, why would he mock Christians like that? Well, because he knew they were a thing. Christians were getting pretty popular back then. So if someone is being parodied in the 2nd century, it means they were well known. So there you have 6 ancient sources from people who weren't Christian, weren't trying to promote Christianity, and yet they confirmed that Jesus really existed. Now, this doesn't prove that he was the Son of God. That's a matter of faith. But it does prove that he was a real person who lived during the 1st century. He was crucified under Roman authority. He had followers who believed he was divine, and his movement spread quickly enough to catch the attention of the entire empire. Personally, I love finding connections between faith and history. It's fascinating to explore how ancient beliefs shaped our world, and how our world has changed and stayed the same over time. It's not always easy to separate fact from fiction, but when you find solid evidence of something most people think is just a myth or a fairy tale, it really makes you think. Now I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about what we've talked about today? Have you heard of Tacitus or Josephus before? Did any of this surprise you? And most importantly, how do you feel now that you know these sources exist? Feel free to share your thoughts, stories, or experiences related to this topic. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you haven't already. Truly helps support my work. Thanks and see you soon.